thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to have stopped walking up that hill and to have arrived. So it's great to say just a few words tonight. Can you hear me all right without the microphone, or would you rather I used it? Okay, so far so good? Okay, well just shout if I quieten down as the evening goes on. So I was asked to say a few words about sustainability in general, looking particularly at the global level and then the national level and the local level. And that's kind of several PhDs work, so it'll be a fairly cursory glance. But as I was thinking about that task of talking about sustainability, it struck me that in some respects maybe green campaigners have missed a trick by using that word, because it's almost lost its resonance now, its meaning. You know, when you hear different companies talking about sustainable growth, sustainable coal mining, sustainable oil drilling, I mean, it just really doesn't mean much anymore. And in many respects, it also sounds perhaps a bit technical. It sounds something a bit removed from life as we know it, life as we live it on a day-to-day basis. And so I was thinking that it would be really helpful to unpack the term a little bit and talk about, you know, greener living, fairer living, and to see if we can try to make it a bit more compelling and a bit more tangible and a bit less technical. Which is not to say that when the phrase sustainable development was first used by Brundtland in the 1987 report running up to the Rio Earth Summit, there when sustainable development was defined for the first time, it did mean something a bit more specific at least. It talked about development that met the needs of people alive today without compromising the needs of future generations. And if you really take that definition to heart, then I think it is quite useful, because it does suggest that business as usual, in other words, more and more production and consumption of finite resources, actually isn't sustainable in any meaningful interpretation of the word, because clearly, if we're looking into the future, if we're looking to future generations, then if the planet is a planet of finite size and finite resources, then it's fairly obvious that you can't go on with current production and consumption patterns, much as governments and companies would like to believe that you can. Even if you improve efficiency, even if we have the best technology in the world, I think the bottom line is that when you've got a world with a rising population, and indeed not just a rising population, but a rising population which expects to have more and more things, quite understandably, as we in the West have done, then it's very hard for us to stand here and deny that to India or China. But it does mean then that if we've got a world where the general expectation is that people are going to want more, then that growth of more stuff is going to outweigh any improvements that we make on efficiency or technology. Which I think basically brings us back to the idea that when we're trying to live more sustainable lives, greener, fairer lives, then that is going to involve behaviour change as well as the best efficiency that we can manage, the best technological change that we can manage. So as I say, I think that we need to unpack the term and maybe to try to understand what we all mean by sustainability. And so if I were to think, what do I mean by a sustainable community, for example, then I would mean a community where, yes, for example, perhaps some of the energy is produced from renewable resources, where there's good, affordable, regular, reliable public transport, where waste is properly recycled, where we minimise the amount of waste we produce in the first place, where homes are properly insulated, where gardens are cultivated, where we have allotments. But it's also a community where you know your neighbours. It's also a community where you feel safe. It's a community where you have meaningful work. And it's a community, crucially, where people genuinely are able to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. In other words, I think what sustainability is about is not just a product, it's not just an end goal. It's actually the whole process of how you get there. And for those of you who are old enough to remember the Agenda 21 process, which was again one of the processes that came out of the Rio Earth Summit from '92, Agenda 21 was supposed to be a way in which local councils involved local people and different communities locally in drawing up visions of what their community would look like if it were genuinely to be sustainable. But the important thing about it was not simply to end up with a document that would then go on a shelf and gather dust over the years. It was actually the process itself of bringing people together that was a really critical part of that. So participation and process is crucial to sustainability. And so is the idea of fairness and equality. For me, social justice and environmental justice are absolutely linked for a number of reasons. I mean, there are all kinds of links. We know, for example, that poorest people are most likely to be affected by environmental problems. They're less likely, for example, to be able to afford to move away from polluted areas. They're more likely to, for example, have to depend on good public transport, so it matters to them that there are good environmental policies there. But it's also, I think sustainability is also related to fairness, because there's lots of evidence out there that suggests that fairer communities, fairer societies, are also ones that tend to have better environmental outcomes as well. And I just want to commend a book to you that many of you I'm sure will know, but it's called The Spirit Level by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. It's been in the press a lot recently. And basically the spirit level is all kinds of empirical evidence brought together, which basically shows that fairer societies tend to have better outcomes on a whole range of different indicators, whether that's to do with health, whether it's to do with reductions in crime, whether it's to do with fewer people having problems with substance misuse, for example, and whether it's to do with people measuring their well-being as being better. So already in that book they established that fairer societies tend to be ones where people have higher levels of well-being. But also in that book there's some really interesting material, empirical evidence that they've gathered from different societies that show as well that more equal societies are less likely to be societies with more and more environmental damage, because they make the case that a lot of our environmental footprint is driven by kind of a status competition, in a sense, where in very unequal societies there's more pressure to try to catch up with your neighbour, therefore that probably means more consumption, which in turn, at the minute at least, leads to more environmental destruction as well. So I think that fairness and sustainability are absolutely linked for the reason that I've described, but also if we go back to that Brundtland definition, which was about sustainable development being development that not only met our needs today, but did it in a way that didn't compromise future generations. I think if you involve that idea of fairness, not just being fair to people in this country, fair to people globally, that's difficult enough, but then when you add in trying to be fair to future generations, that, I think, that notion of intergenerational equity is one that's pretty much missing from most discussions in politics today. We've got a coalition government that's very fond of talking about fairness. They're not great at delivering it here, but they're certainly not great about thinking about it in terms of that longer-term perspective as well. Because if we were to genuinely think about those future generations, I think we would be doing things very differently. So that's a little bit about how I understand sustainability. How does that actually translate into real action? How do we move from the theory to the practice? Well, I think with that definition of sustainability, if you're looking at something like, for example, the Cancun Climate Summit, which will happen at the end of this month, it would perhaps make it more obvious that any kind of climate negotiation has to have social justice, has to have equity at its heart. And having followed the climate negotiations for many years, I think it's very clear that one of the main obstacles to reaching an agreement, a binding framework agreement on reducing climate gases, has been that sense that the poorer countries feel that the richer countries are basically trying to stop them developing, that we have done very well, thank you very much, from exploiting the Earth's resources through emitting many greenhouse gas emissions, and now we're trying to stop developing countries from being able to develop themselves. That's how it's quite understandably perceived, I think, by many governments and by many people in poorer countries. And I think, in a sense, they're right, that in a sense, because the richer countries are overwhelmingly responsible for the amount of climate change we've had to date, then I think that means that we have an overwhelming responsibility to do the most to try to tackle it. And that means, I think, putting significant amounts of resources on the table at those negotiations, not as some kind of aid, but genuinely as a kind of compensation for the fact that we have overused what was our fair allocation of resources. If you look at how much environmental space, as people sometimes call it, how much emissions we've emitted, which has then, in a sense, reduced the amount that poorer countries can safely put into the atmosphere. So we're going to need financial resources, we're going to need technological transfer for poorer countries, we're going to need frameworks like, there's a complicated one out there called contraction and convergence, but what it essentially simply means is that we work out how many more emissions we can safely put into the atmosphere, we work out how many people there are in the world, and we try to allocate, well, what would a fair allocation of emission rights look like, and then we try to converge to that point. And clearly it can't happen overnight, but if you took a endpoint of perhaps 2050, and you looked at how much more developed countries ourselves have to reduce our emissions to allow developing countries the space to be able to develop, hopefully in a more environmentally friendly way than we have, but nonetheless it's clear that if we're to leave them enough space to grow, then we in the north have to reduce our production and consumption significantly. This is all very well, but where's the political will going to come from to make this happen, I hear you ask, particularly at a time of economic difficulty and so forth. And I must say for myself, that question of how do we generate political will is the most important question, because it's not as if when it comes to tackling climate change, we don't know roughly what we need to do. We know exactly, really, more or less what we need to do. It's not a technical problem. It's not even really primarily a financial problem. You know, when it came to bailing out the banks, we found billions down the back of the sofa in a matter of a few days. You know, if the planet were a bank, we'd have sorted this out many years ago. So it's not really a financial challenge even, it is this challenge of political will, and how do we galvanise that? And I don't know how many of you have seen that wonderful film, The Age of Stupid, but it's a film that's based on the premise of some kind of climate catastrophe. Pete Postlethwaite, the actor, is the sole survivor of this climate catastrophe based in 2050. And he looks back to where we are today, and he says these words that really, every time I say them, it brings the hairs up on the back of my neck, because I think they are the most important words. And he says, "Why is it, knowing what we knew then, didn't we act when there was still time?" Very simple words. But to me, that is the question. You know, there is overwhelming evidence out there that we are contributing to dangerous warming of the climate. We know the actions that are contributing to it, and yet we still go on doing it. I mean, you know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is one of the definitions of insanity. And we seem to be doing that rather well. And so the question really is, I think, will we manage to galvanise that political will fast enough to tackle climate change equitably, or will we go down as a species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction rather than trying to take active steps to avoid it? And frankly, the jury's out. I mean, there was a debate in Parliament yesterday on Cancun, on this big climate summit, the successor to the Copenhagen climate summit. This is the next big time when all of the governments will get together to discuss climate change. And I am ashamed to tell you that there were 12 members of Parliament in that debate. You know, why wasn't the pressure sufficiently there to mean that people felt that they were going to be watched if they weren't there, that what they said mattered, and that there was real, you know, political will to make stuff happen? So, in terms of trying to think about how we galvanise that political will, it made me think again about, you know, maybe what the Green Movement is not getting as right as we could do. And I think perhaps one of the things that we should do better and could do better is, instead of scaring the life out of people about what will happen if we don't address climate change fast enough, maybe we need to get better at painting that positive vision of what a greener world would look like, so that it's actually motivating people by the thought of something good rather than scaring people by the thought of something bad. Because fear isn't a terribly good motivator of changing behaviour in many respects. Many people get more motivated by a more compelling vision of what society could be like. I mean, Martin Luther King left us his dream, not his nightmare, and I think we need to get better at painting that dream of what a greener society would be like. And the good news is that the measures that we need to tackle climate change, for example, are measures which in themselves are likely to improve our quality of life in a whole range of ways. And so, for example, if we're talking about weaning ourselves off private car use and having better public transport, well, it seems to me that more affordable, more reliable, more efficient and nicer public transport is a pretty good thing to have. In the 21st century, we still have a situation where people are dying of fuel poverty. They're dying because they can't keep their homes warm enough every winter, thousands of people. And this is in a civilised country. So if we had, for example, a rollout of insulation to every single home in Britain, you know, that would be a very positive thing. If we had stronger local economies, that would be a very good thing, so that we had more resilient economies when difficulties happen. And crucially about this whole vision of a greener society, would be one where there are hundreds of thousands of more jobs being able to be created. Because there's some really interesting figures that have been done about how many jobs can be created by different kinds of activities. And so if you're mining coal, or if you're using oil, for example, the number of jobs per, I think it's a terawatt hour, but don't quote me. Anyway, basically the number of jobs created by a particular unit of energy is around 250. But by comparison, if you're looking at wind energy, for example, it's up to about 900 or 1,000. And so that's why I think that it's not fanciful to talk about, you know, a major investment in green technologies now, even though we are in a time of economic difficulty. First of all, because I don't think the best way of addressing the deficit is by throwing out of work 500,000 public sector workers and then somehow thinking that the private sector won't be affected by that. I mean, all of the evidence from the past is that if you do that in the public sector, there are plenty and plenty of private sector jobs that rely on the public sector, and there's more likely to trigger the losses in the private sector too. So you could be looking at the loss of 1 million jobs. You know, what we need to do is to be getting people into work so that their money is paying into the taxes, so that we're not having to pay redundancies and benefits and all the rest of it. So it's not sort of rocket science in a way. And one of the fastest ways of getting people back to work would be precisely through something like, you know, a massive rollout of for example, insulation in people's homes and green energy and so on. There's just a little microcosm from what happened in Kirklees up in Yorkshire, where they basically leveraged some money from the energy companies. They had some council money, and what they've done is to roll out free insulation for 40,000 homes. And what that's done is saved each family around £150 a year on their fuel bills. It's created 200 jobs, and it's got emissions down. You know, this is a kind of win-win that we should be really promoting, I think. So, a few last words about what this kind of approach would mean locally. Well, there are some fantastic initiatives in Brighton that I think deserve support. One of the ones that I'm very excited about is the Brighton Energy Co-op that you might have heard of, with it's basically trying to be the UK's first solar energy cooperative, taking advantage of the new feed-in tariffs. And the idea there again is, putting that sort of equity and community at the heart of what you mean by sustainability. So it's not just about generating energy from a sustainable source, but it's about how the community comes together and works as a cooperative to be able to put money back into the system and do things in a more equitable way. It's about things like reclaiming space, as was very effectively done, at least for a short time, with the Lewis Road Community Garden. And there are organisations, I met one the other day called Meanwhile Space. It's a fantastic organisation. If you just tick it into your Google, then you'll find out about Meanwhile Space, and what they do is they make use of so-called waste space until someone else comes along and rents it or does something else with it. And some councils are actually employing them to go around and find this space and find good uses for the space through, for example, you know, artists using it as studios or green organisations using it for environmental things. It makes such good sense, you know, and as long as you've got the legal safeguards, which means that when, you know, the term of the contract comes to an end, you know that you're going to be able to have the space back again, then it seems to be, again, a win-win proposal. The Brighton and Hove food partnership, another example where they're increasing the amount of food grown in the city. They're trying to reduce waste, and again, really nice ideas of growing food around the space around council blocks, for example, bits of space which can often look rather run down, actually using that for local use. And finally, just to say a few words about what I've been trying to do as your MP on this agenda. One of the big things that's just been in the news for the last few weeks, which you might have seen, has been the government's plan to sell off England's forests. And so I've been asking some questions about that, not least about what safeguards there are for the woodland if it then goes into private hands. On the one hand, they're saying, well, you'd still need licenses if you wanted to cut the woods down, the trees down. But things like, well, what about public access? Although you couldn't put out a sign saying keep out, on the other hand, at the minute at least, there would be no legal obligation to keep those footways, you know, accessible and easy to use. On illegal logging, there's a real loophole in some EU legislation that's about to come into force, which will mean that it will be illegal to place illegally logged timber on the market for the first time, but the possession of illegally logged timber will not be an offence. The coalition government said they were going to close that loophole in the coalition agreement that they signed in May. I now have a letter from the minister saying that they've changed their mind and they're not going to bother closing the loophole. So again, that's something that I'm pushing hard on. Yesterday, I managed to get an adjournment debate. These are the debates that happen at the end of the sort of formal session of the day. And the debate that I had with the minister was about oil drilling off the west of Shetland. I don't know how many of you might have noticed, but the government basically sneaked out agreement to allow Chevron to start trying to drill it off the west of Shetland before we've got the results of what caused the Deepwater Horizon spill and tragedy with 11 people killed and untold environmental and economic damage. Now, the EU Commissioner has said there should be a moratorium. He's basically said anyone sensible would have a moratorium until we've got the results of the Deepwater Horizon review and report, which is due next year. And yet, rather than waiting for that, the government's gone ahead with more deep water drilling licences, as I say, sneaked out in October when Parliament was in recess, using much the same technology as was used in the Gulf of Mexico. And since we don't know what caused the Deepwater Horizon problem, and given that the Deepwater Horizon rig was inspected just 2 weeks before the problem happened, then to have the government gaily saying, well, don't worry, we've doubled the number of inspections, which basically means from 2 till 4 a year, isn't that reassuring, really. I took part in the debate as one of the 12 on Cancun, and I'm trying to put parliamentary questions, particularly on the issue of financing, climate finance, because that is going to be a make or break thing at Cancun, I think. And again, one of the things I would love to see is a bit more momentum behind things like the Robin Hood tax. I take the point that at a time when governments are cutting budgets, it's harder to make the case for more money for climate finance, let's say. But when there are all kinds of ways of getting that money, the Robin Hood tax is one. Even if you were to do it in the UK alone, it could probably raise around 20 billion. If you did it globally, obviously, it would raise an awful lot more. Things like cracking down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. Again, billions go lost each year because of that. And what does the government do? It's actually cutting back staff in the revenue rather than actually increasing staff in HMRC. And finally, and this is where I wanted to make one last connection back to Brighton, I'm also the chair of an all-party group on fuel poverty and energy efficiency. Because again, trying to think, obviously one of my great motivators is concern about the environment, concern about climate change, but obviously for many other people that isn't a motivator, but something like reducing their fuel bills, trying to keep their homes warm, is a motivating issue, and that's how they would relate to it. And so, given that in Brighton we have such bad housing stock in many parts of the city, not least in the private rented sector, then trying to do as much as possible to make sure that we get real measures from the government, including proper grants and support for people to insulate their homes. It seems to be a very practical way forward. So there's a bill coming out from the government in the next month or so, where they're launching something called the Green Deal, which is essentially going to be where you will be able to use feed-in tariffs and other mechanisms to try to get your homes to be more environmentally friendly through insulation and so forth, and then you pay it back off your fuel bills. Now, that's fine for people that are in a position to feel that they can take that on, and there is guarantees, there's supposed to be guarantees that you will benefit in the end, that the money that you save on your fuel bill will pay for the cost of the solar panels or the insulation or whatever it is. But the people on lower incomes, they're going to need an awful lot of persuasion to take that kind of measure. So I think we need really proper, dedicated measures for people on those lower incomes. And in Brighton today, I'd organised an energy fair in the Friends Meeting House, which was basically people from the Warm Front scheme, which is a scheme precisely designed for people on lower incomes, where they do give grants still, at least until April. So it's really important that people take them up, because they stop in April. So you can get proper grants to insulate your homes if you're on lower incomes. And they had benefits advice there as well. These people have come down from Newcastle and give free benefits advice to make sure that people are claiming everything that they're allowed to claim. But sadly, thanks to the dear Argus, which admittedly they were on strike today, so I was out of the picket line, but when they're not on strike, they're not that great at covering some of this stuff anyway, so they didn't cover it. The council refused to support it. So as a result, there weren't very many people there, which is a real shame, because there was lots and lots of expertise in the Friends Meeting House today. So those are the kinds of things that I think can make a difference. I think it really is important to make the links between what we do locally and the bigger picture, not to feel that what we do is insignificant. It can sometimes feel insignificant, but as someone said, that a mosquito might feel insignificant, but if you're in bed with a mosquito, even though it's very, very small, it can be quite significant.